Well, I saw Guillermo del Toro's Frankenstein, as have many of you, and even if you haven't, I'm sure you've noticed the enormous volume of hot takes that it's produced. From my end, I'm seeing an equal number of people completely enamored with it, and people who are seething with rage. And honestly, people on both sides of the argument don't even all have the same opinions. The people glazing the movie all like it for different reasons, and the haters hate it for different reasons. And as a result, we're getting some of the most circular, confused, and aimless movie discourse I have seen in years. It's like a cacophony of isolated discussions with very high emotions that don't seem to really have, like, a goal for a larger discussion because there isn't one. And then you have me, a fence sitter with a lot of conflicted feelings. I know a lot of things about Frankenstein, both the movie and the book, in part because my wife is like the president of Frankenstein Book Nation and really ought to have a PhD on the subject. As we walked into that theater armed with our ugly son and her custom-made Victor Frankenstein stand shirt, we had no idea what we were going to be fed by our special boy Guillermo del Toro. We both love this guy. Huge fan of Crimson Peak and The Shape of Water. He's genuinely a visionary, and as a spooky guy history fan myself, I pretty much inherently resonate with anything he makes. So I was sitting there in the theater like, oh boy, a fun Gothic horror film. What lovely visuals. What fun drama. And right next to me, my wife was like,
you are the monster.
So needless to say, she hates it, and while I liked it, I still had some really strong issues. And after actually reading the original book and revisiting some of the Frankenstein marketing, I think I might understand why this movie is drawing so much ire. It's not a problem that begins or ends with Guillermo del Toro or Hollywood. It's a misunderstanding of the story at large, a story by a traumatized young woman that, from the very moment it was published, has never once been adapted faithfully. But why? What are the fears that make Frankenstein so complicated? Where the fuck did we go wrong? Come learn with me. But first, let's take a quick moment to talk about something extra exciting. I am now on Nebula. Nebula is a prestige streaming service that you might have heard from some of your other favorite creators like Bernadette Banner, Abby Cox, Abigail Thorne, Tara Mooney, and many, many more. And those are just a few that I assume a lot of my audience watches. Nebula seriously has topics for every interest, from travel to science to history to fashion to animation and more. This is truly a hub for thoughtful videos tailor-made to get you curious and supporting creators directly. It's ad-free, easy to access and navigate, and also, honestly, a great gift idea, what with the holidays on the horizon, because they offer gift cards and guest passes as well. You can actually watch regularly uploaded videos from YouTube on Nebula, but many creators offer early Nebula access so that you can watch your favorite creators before the public does. And there's also a ton of Nebula exclusive content, such as behind-the-scenes videos, extras, random fun videos, or even entirely Nebula exclusive videos and Nebula originals, which are special, high-production shows created by and for Nebula. A Nebula original that I've been loving recently is Amy's Dead End Dream House, created by and starring the amazing Maggie Mae Fish. It's like a wacky adult Pee-wee's Playhouse with quirky puppetry and sets, exploring more mature topics with humor and a touch of a surrealist edge. You can find me on Nebula now, so far with just my regular videos, but I'm really looking forward to creating unique videos just for folks on Nebula and maybe some other extra things. Right now, Nebula is offering 50% off from yearly subscriptions during the holidays, going from $60 to $30, or you can get it for life at just $500 full price, which is already a great deal, but if you use my code, you can get 40% off of that for $300. That price for a lifetime of amazing shows and videos and supporting creators directly is such a fantastic offer, but if you want to test it out first, you can get a 3-day free trial as well to see how you like it and immerse yourself in an enormous pool of amazing things to watch. Head to the link in the description below, go.nebula.tv/Kazro to sign up for Nebula, check out great shows like Amy's Dead End Dream House, and I hope I'll see you there. Now let's get back to learning about Frankenstein. I'm not going to beat around the bush here. I think Guillermo del Toro's Frankenstein has generated such weird discourse because leading up to the release of the film, some insinuations from from various journalists and fans were building up this anxious expectation of how much the movie was going to reflect the source material.
Frankly, all the movies that I've seen don't really do justice or align themselves with the novel. So I feel Guillermo's is pretty close, pretty close.
In Guillermo's defense, he was pretty clear from the get-go that this was going to be his interpretation of the story that captures the spirit of the novel.
You know, when I was a child, I promised Monstrous to be faithful to them, and I have. And I've been their friend, and I've told their tales, and this is one more.
He also has stated that Frankenstein is one of his favorite novels and biggest inspiration, so Frankenheads across the globe were hoping that he would do the story justice. And here lies the problem. This movie is, at best, only like 10 to 15% book accurate. It's more like a fanfic of the 1930s Universal Frankenstein than the book. It's not very close to Mary Shelley's story whatsoever. What it actually is a pretty run-of-the-mill, good Guillermo del Toro story. Guillermo, more than anything else, loves telling a Beauty and the Beast story, a man is the real monster story, and that's what this is. That is not in any way the story that Mary Shelley wrote, and we aren't going to get very far in this discussion unless you know what that is. So I present to you an abridged recap of Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus. The book in its entirety is in the form of a bunch of letters that a sea captain named Robert Walton is writing to his sister. It's the year 17-something, and he has a lot of time on his hands because his ship is stuck in ice in the Arctic. My dear Sister Margaret, ugh, I need a man. All I want in life is for a hot guy to drop out of the sky and land on my ship on the brink of death so I can nurse him back to health, and then maybe we can smooch a little. So Victor Frankenstein basically drops out of nowhere onto his ship, half dead already, and he's like, hey guys, have you seen a huge ugly guy running around here? The sailors are like, yeah, come to think of it, we did see a huge ugly guy on a dog sled a while ago, why? Anyway, then Victor passes out and Walton is like, oh, this is my chance, and he nurses him back to health, at which point Victor begins the yap session of the century as to how he got here, and also his literal entire life story. He had, genuinely, the perfect childhood, growing up in Geneva with doting, well-to-do parents. At some point, they take in a lovely young ward named Elizabeth Lavenza, and she and Victor are very close. He also has a younger brother named Ernest, but he's not important. There's also some other gal who lives here, but I can't quite remember who the hell that is. Anyway, then he also becomes friends with a merchant's hot son named Henry Clerval. Victor is living his best life with his girlfriend Elizabeth and his boyfriend Henry, and his mom has a baby named William, and then Victor goes off to college abroad. He had already been interested in some pretty occult subjects, namely the alchemical studies of Paracelsus and Agrippa. His professor at school was like, holy shit, you're into that stuff? That's obscene. But a different professor encouraged him and even showed him how he could advance his studies. And so, Victor undertakes his mission to imbue life into a corpse, to alchemically create a human being. How exactly did he do that? Don't worry about it. Well, he succeeds, and the minute the creature opens his eyes, Victor is absolutely disgusted. Fuck, what the hell did I just do? Ew, ew, ew. And then he runs away, and then has a several weeks long nervous breakdown, while Henry Clerval has to nurse him back to health. Elizabeth sends Victor a letter that's basically like, hey Victor, how's it going? You probably don't remember this, but there's this girl named Justine that we grew up with and you were super close to. Anyway, here's her entire backstory that you probably already know, but the reader doesn't, so I have to explain it. And Victor is like, Justine, huh? I don't really care about that. My beloved Elizabeth's letter has healed me. I'm all better now. And I haven't seen my ugly son anywhere, so all must be well. And then Victor's dad sends him a letter that's like, hey man, come home right now because your baby brother William has just been murdered. Victor rushes home at once, and on his journey, spots the creature in the distance, and with no proof whatsoever, immediately assumes that the creature is the murderer. But when he gets home, they tell him that Justine, whoever that is, has been arrested for the crime. No, this can't be right. Well, Justine is tried and forced into a confession and then executed. Rest in peace, Justine, we barely knew ya. Victor is despondent and goes hiking to gather his thoughts when suddenly, what's this? Who's that huge ugly guy barreling towards Victor at terminal velocity? It's the creature, and he's got a few things to say. Victor doesn't really want to hear it because he correctly assumed that the creature murdered William, but the creature is like, come on, man, you gave birth to me and then you abandoned me? The least you can do is hear me out. So they go to the creature's Airbnb for Yap Sesh 2. The creature then regales his tale of woe, how he left Victor's apartment and lived in the woods eating berries and roots and acorns and stuff. He really emphasizes how much he ate those things. He didn't know a dang old thing, he was just a little guy, slowly learning about the world. Eventually he posts up in a hovel next to a cottage where an old blind guy and his 2 kids live, and he watches them to learn about human life, language, and reading. He starts to crave human connection, hoping to earn the family's trust and companionship. One day, while the kids are out, the creature finally approaches the blind man, but doesn't get really far into explaining his situation before the kids return and beat the shit out of him. The family leaves the cottage, the creature ventures off alone again, rejected and attacked at every turn by people. He begins to develop hate in his heart, and discovers Victor's journal in his pocket, learning of the manner of his creation through it. Now he's even more mad. Fuck you, Victor. Fuck you for bringing me into this world and abandoning me. The creature makes his way to Geneva to find Victor, when he encounters young William and is like, sorry kid, but I'm gonna kidnap you now. I'll raise you as my own to be my buddy. William is like, ew, stay away from me, uggo. Creature is like, oh my god, you're related to Victor. I knew that reaction seemed familiar. I gotta kill you now. Rest in peace, William, we barely knew ya. Anyway, so ends the creature's Yap Fest, and Victor feels conflicted and 100% responsible for William's death. The blood on these hands will never be clean. Creature is like, yeah, sorry about that, man, but being alive really sucks, and honestly, I'm willing to just fuck off and leave you alone forever on one condition. Make me a bride, a lady just like me, just as chopped as I am, so I can at least have a companion. But like, if not, you know, I'll kill everyone you love, your choice. Victor finds himself in a conundrum and a deep depression, which is nothing a European tour with his boyfriend Henry Clerval can't fix. They go on a gay little vacation, and then suddenly Victor tells Henry to go away, and he starts working on the creature's bride. But once he's almost done, it hits him. Fuck! What if the bride is more evil than the creature, and then I have unleashed 2 demons upon humanity? Isn't that irresponsible? And as soon as the creature arrives, Victor destroys the bride, limb from limb. And, well, you guessed it, the creature tracks down and murders what Victor loves the most, Henry Clerval, and then Elizabeth. There's also a whole thing where Victor ends up in a prison in Ireland and goes mad with grief and gets addicted to laudanum because of Henry's death. Long story. Anyway, so Victor, now with nothing to lose, sets off on a life mission to murder the creature. He chases him across Europe, up into the Arctic, and well, here we are. Robert Walton is like, wow, Victor, you were so sexy while telling me that story all alone in my quarters, no one else around, just the 2 of us, 2 hot guys. What if we had feelings for each other and we were both boys? And Victor is like, Jesus Christ, man, how could you ever think you could be to me what Henry and Elizabeth were? Blah. After Victor dies, the creature shows up and is kind of sad about it, but also relieved at the consummation of his revenge. He's like, Walton, I don't know what Victor said about me, but he's a lying ass bitch. This guy sucked. You could do better. Return to the grinder mines. Well, my turn to die now. Here I go. Bye. And then he disappears at the end. All right, so as you can see, the book is vastly different from the film. That's okay. Like, obviously a film, especially a film made by a director with a very specific vision, is not going to be a one-to-one rendition of a 19th century novel. Film requires different things to be good and entertaining, but I think the reason a lot of people are upset is because they kind of expected that this movie would finally capture the actual spirit of the novel, and the unfortunate reality is, it didn't. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is a story in which every single person, from Victor to the briefest unnamed side character, is a morally complex monster. And what makes it so interesting is, as you read the story, you kind of understand why everyone does what they do. No one is perfect, and everyone is forced to reckon with these existential questions about humanity and duty and compassion. Victor is a young college student, one with great ambitions who loves the people in his life. His great folly is his own fears and prejudices towards his own creation, and his abandonment of his creation, forcing the creature to enter the world confused and unguided. This is what makes Victor a monster. No matter how much he tries to take responsibility for his actions afterwards, he has already fucked up so badly that nothing he does can fix the problem, and in fact can only make it worse. He's left with no good path to take, and in the end loses everything for it. Meanwhile, the creature, who is abandoned and left to wander alone, craves compassion and companionship, but the fear and confusion from the outside world, who are terrified of him due to his grotesque appearance, let's be real here, he looks like nothing they'd ever seen before and they don't know what he is. It earns him nothing but abuse and malice. This rejection by humanity, despite having done nothing wrong and having been victimized since his very birth, fills the creature with rage. Hatred makes him a monster. And he goes after his creator, Victor, and takes from him everything he loves. Henry, William, Elizabeth, Justine, I guess, and his father. And when the creature asks Victor for a companion, he has already murdered William, resulting in Justine's death, instilling a paranoia in Victor that is understandably impossible to overcome. Victor has sympathy for the creature and feels responsibility, and so initially agrees to create a bride for him, but he can't move past the thoughts of, oh God, the creature has killed before and has threatened me that he might kill again. How do I know that he would actually leave me alone after this? What if the bride is more violent? What if she rejects him too, and now things get worse and there's two monsters at large? How can I sacrifice potentially swaths of humanity to this violence just because I fear for my own life? So he destroys the bride and abandons his promise. And in retaliation, the creature makes good on his promise and murders Henry and Elizabeth, the two people that Victor loves the most. The two of them were trapped in an inescapable, vicious cycle with no good answer because, of course, you can understand Victor's fear and guilt, but you can also understand the creature's pain and desperation. He never asked to be created, and at every turn when he shows humanity, his kindness is just met with violence. After months of doing good favors for the cottagers, they beat him brutally as soon as they see him. When he saves a young girl from drowning, her father shoots him without a second thought. The cottagers had no idea who he was, just that he was some frightening-looking man all of a sudden in their home with their blind father. The peasant father didn't know the creature saved his daughter from drowning, he just saw some frightening man holding his daughter. I don't think any of us in their circumstances may have reacted differently. That's the powerful nuance of Mary Shelley's tale. The sad thing is, the Guillermo del Toro movie completely removes this nuance, and that's kind of the biggest issue that I have with the film. In watering each character down to an over-the-top caricaturization, you're erasing all the moral complexity that the story had. How is that in the spirit of Mary Shelley's book? You need an easy, singular villain, so Victor becomes this cartoonish, evil madman, abusive father with no one in his life that he loves. Henry Clerval's completely gone, replaced with the weird uncle who didn't need to be there. William is aged up and made into Elizabeth's fiance to create some sort of weird sexual quandary and tension, and Victor's parents, who were so happy and loving in the book, are made into a tragic case of a cruel and abusive father speeding the death of a loving mother, who is also played by Mia Goth to create some sort of underexplored Oedipal complex that drives a milk-obsessed Victor to want to create life to cope with the loss of his mother. He loves no one and is fixated on Elizabeth through lust, and therefore in part hates the creature because he perceives the creature as a competitor for Elizabeth's affections.
You are the monster.
This also creates a huge pacing problem in the film. In order to justify all of these new caricaturizations in the story, they now have to fill it out with new plot lines to make it all make sense and answer seemingly unanswered questions from the book. Why is Victor suddenly evil? Here's his extended traumatic origin story. How does he get the money for his experiments? Here's some weird guy who wants to bankroll him. How did he actually create the creature? Here's a long sequence of him setting up his mad scientist tower and creating the monster.
You are the monster.
None of this is bad per se, but God, it needed to be cut down. Edit, Guillermo, please. The irony of me saying this when this video is almost certainly gonna be like over an hour long. I'll be the first to admit, I'm a hypocrite. In the book, Victor abandons the creature instantly, which a lot of people find confusing. Personally, I don't struggle with that, but the movie tries to complicate Victor and the creature's relationship by having him be a good father at first and then becoming abusive when the creature struggles to learn to speak, eventually imprisoning and torturing him, and then leaving him to die.
You are the monster.
In contrast, Elizabeth identifies with the creature. I mean, her entire theme is the insect in a cage, so in the end, she's clearly supposed to be interpreted as the bride of Frankenstein. It's literally in the script. I don't know, in the book, Elizabeth and the creature don't meet until he literally murders her off screen. But again, Guillermo del Toro wants to do a Beauty and the Beast thing. That's what he likes to do. It's what he's passionate about. The thing is, isolated, all of this isn't really too bad. But the movie isn't isolated. This is an adaptation of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, so inevitably, it has to be compared to the source. And I just think that a lot of the decisions made here are not really in the spirit of or in service to the story.
You are the monster.
The movie explores monstrous masculinity, and we'll get into that, but all of the other societal and personal fears that drove Mary Shelley to write this story are gone, and I think that's a big loss. There's a couple folks on Instagram who explained their feelings on the matter in a much better way than I think I am. The first being Carson Glutenberg Bible, who covered her opinions on the changes Guillermo made to the story.
I was disappointed in the way that all the nuance was flattened out of Victor's character and of the creature. In the novel, we get a really complicated story about monstrosity. Victor does something monstrous when he creates and then abandons his creature. He is obsessed, he is selfish, he is reckless, he is also young, he is instantly regretful, and he is in the middle of an extended nervous breakdown. But in the movie, we get a version of Victor who is just callous, cruel, and really abusive. He has no real loving relationships with family and friends, and he has no compassion for the creature at all until the end of the movie, which didn't feel earned at all to me. And the movie's version of the creature, meanwhile, is just a straightforward victim, and he only kills accidentally or in self-defense when other people are trying to kill him. Whereas in the book, the creature does horrible things. He murders innocent people in calculated retaliation against Victor. If Victor is only cruel and abusive and the monster is only tender and mistreated, then just all the complexity gets emptied out of the story. We don't have to think about the fact that Victor created a monster not through the act of physically creating, but through the act of abandonment. We don't have to confront the ways that the world can turn a gentle and innocent person into a bitter and violent one through rejection and cruelty. And in case there was any shred of nuance left to the story, we have William turn to Victor and with his dying breath say, "You are the monster," as if they're turning to us in the audience and saying, "Do you get it?"
And then there's the ever-eloquent Renee, the Play RX Cure, who had this to say.
Nowadays, we've replaced all of this myth and story with algorithmic content. Scrolling through content that basically has no more nutritional value in it than cotton candy. No emotional labor, no moral questioning, no imaginative participation is required at all to consume the content we are bombarded with 24/7. It's like we're overfed, but we're starving. And we're starving for something that we don't quite know what it is, but I'm telling you, the thing that we are starving for is meaning. The good news about all of this is that the moral imagination is not dead, it's just dormant. And it's our job to dig it up from the grave and revive it. And you can do that by reading stories that refuse to comfort you, that demand you to ask bigger questions about the challenges and the struggles that human beings are faced with. And I'm not talking about these stories that are on Netflix or in the movies where it's so over-exaggerated that you can hardly identify yourself inside of them. I'm talking about the things that really ask deep existential questions. Read Frankenstein and watch Victor go through hell when he tries to take responsibility for what he's created. Read Jung about the shadow that lives inside of yourself at all times. Or look at a Goya painting and be met with the horror of mental health problems and social unrest. And when it's time for you to create things that are meaningful to you that don't necessarily have answers. Wisdom will never come from perfectly curated aesthetic and one-dimensional statement pieces.
I wholeheartedly agree. I think a lot of modern media falls victim to our desire for familiar structures and easily identified evils.
You are the monster.
We crave a big bad and a big good in our stories because then we sort of don't need to look inwards or feel uncomfortable. My problem with the new Frankenstein isn't really its departure from the book, or even that Victor is super evil and the creature is super good in an isolated context. Actually, the highly sympathetic creature was my favorite part of the movie, along with how absolutely beautiful the movie is. Jacob Elordi blew it out of the fucking park with this role. I was absolutely taken in by his performance. It was so good, and the attention to detail and love for the craft that is clearly on display from every person who worked on this film is a feast for the eyes. I think what actually bothers me is the loss of all the morally uncomfortable themes that Mary Shelley was reflecting on that forces us to reckon with the horrid predicament of humanity. As Renee said in her video, when you're put in these situations, what sacrifices to morality would you make to survive? What happens to a person that makes them a monster? And actually, from what I've been seeing online, I think most people in general don't understand these themes. In observing the discourse, I have seen all kinds of wild takes from people claiming that Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein because she was a horny teenage edgelord, to people who think that Frankenstein was secretly actually written by Percy Shelley. And honestly, it's pissing me off. I think Frankenstein Discourse is bad because people don't really understand the themes from the original book in the first place. And you could say, oh, well, I'm not a book purist, so I don't care if the movie has nothing at all to do with the book, so why do its themes even matter? Well, I guess that's your God-given right to feel that way, but nothing exists in isolation, especially not a movie adaptation of a book created by a self-proclaimed Frankenstein superfan. The movie is adapted from a book, so you can't view the movie as wholly its own piece of art, completely divorced from its source material. Of course, it's beholden to the book. If the movie wanted to be critiqued on its own without being attached to the book, it wouldn't be an adaptation of a book. It would just be a random original Guillermo del Toro movie, and he could have done that. And there lies the core of the discourse. People who don't understand or maybe don't care about the book versus people who care a lot about the book, maybe too much, and some in between. I think we need to level the playing field here, so here we go. Let's explore the fears that built Frankenstein: motherhood, modernity, masculinity, and queerness. In the intro to the revised version of Frankenstein, Mary Shelley posits the question thrown at her ever since she conceived her dark tale. How did I, then a young girl, come to think of and dilate upon so very hideous an idea? Of course, the story often starts with a series of extremely stormy nights in 1816 at Villa Diodati on Lake Geneva, surrounded by big personalities: her husband Percy Shelley, Lord Byron, John Polidori, and her half-sister Jane, who was more well known as Claire Clairmont. To cope with their dreary surroundings and being trapped indoors, the group began telling ghost stories, and then writing ones of their own. Out of it came The Vampire, and of course Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein, but her inspirations for this story began long before this challenge. Born on August 30th, 1797 in London, Mary Shelley had an early childhood rife with suffering. Her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, died of postpartum infection mere days after Mary's birth, and her father, William Godwin, remarried to Mary Jane Clairmont in 1801. Mary's new stepmother was not exactly kind or attentive to her. In fact, she could be quite cruel, and Mary felt that the marriage put distance between her and her father. She was also haunted by the pre-existing notoriety of her parents. Both her mother and father were, for the time, radical, and her mother was a noted feminist. Mary Wollstonecraft famously penned A Vindication of the Rights of Women, and Mary latched onto the literary legacy of her parents early on, grieving her lack of a mother figure and desperately craving connection to her father. Mary showed great talents in writing from an early age, and read and reread her parents' books to an almost obsessive degree. But the fact that her mother had died a result of her birth haunted her, and this complicated and traumatic relationship to motherhood would only grow worse after Percy Shelley entered her life in 1812, when Mary was 15 years old. Percy was born August 2nd, 1792, in Sussex to a baronet, Sir Timothy Shelley, and he had a rather delightful childhood, all things considered. He was bright, talented, and precocious, and progressive-minded, which at 19 years old led him to seek a friendship with William Godwin. Godwin quickly began to view Percy as a son, or rather, a very wealthy son, that he could easily weasel money out of, and had him and his wife Harriet over for dinner frequently. It was at one of these dinners that Percy met Mary, and eventually Percy started spending his dinners with Godwin, complaining about his bitch wife. He felt that he had rushed into the marriage, and that he felt, quote, as if a dead and living body had been haled together in some loathsome and horrible communion. So obviously Percy latched onto Mary, and Mary was completely taken with him. She confessed her love to Percy at the grave of Mary Wollstonecraft, where the two of them would often go to read her works. Now, William Godwin was not exactly stoked about this married man sniffing around his teenage daughter. In fact, he was really pissed. He told both of them that they could under no circumstances ever be together, which, of course, in true romantic era fashion, caused Percy to lose his ever-loving mind. His friend Thomas Love Peacock, which is a crazy name, recalled, his eyes were bloodshot, his hair and dress disordered. Nothing that I ever read in tale nor history could present a more striking image of a sudden, violent, irresistible, uncontrollable passion than that under which I found him laboring. Percy began taking laudanum, which certainly made things worse. He went to the Godwins' bookstore, found Mary in the upstairs schoolroom, and demanded that she overdose on laudanum so that, quote, death shall unite them. Then he produced a pistol and threatened to shoot himself. The chaos was quelled by Mary and a few others, but a few days later, Percy overdosed on laudanum anyway and narrowly survived. Despite all this, and her parents putting her under house arrest, Mary still yearned for Percy. This instigated the two lovers to flee England for France in the dead of night, with Mary's half-sister Claire Claremont in tow for some reason. They had a grand and romantic European adventure until they ran out of money, at which point Percy finally went to Harriet, his fucking wife, and was like, hey babe, can you give us some money? Also, is it cool if I call you my sister and not my wife? Because, my hot side chick is here. Harriet, for some godforsaken reason, did give him money, despite his audacity. Of course, shocking no one, Mary ended up pregnant. And meanwhile, Lord Byron was flirting with Claire Claremont, and later had a baby with her, and the two of them got Mary and Percy to have a girls' trip to Geneva. Fuck Harriet, I guess. It was here, on Lake Geneva, that Percy and Byron got really close, and fatefully, sudden extreme stormy weather forced the odd group to remain indoors in darkness, where Lord Byron had a great idea for once. What if we all wrote our own ghost story? As Mary began working on her story, she quietly listened to the enthusiastic discussions of life and death, horror, electrical science, and Darwinism between Byron and Percy. These discussions were key inspirations for the mechanics and science behind the experiments of Victor Frankenstein. But one of the greatest thematic influences came full circle the next year, when Mary gave birth to her daughter prematurely, and within only a few days, the baby girl passed away. While Mary grieved and battled her way through the pain of motherhood cut short, Percy neglected her and basically didn't support her at all because he was mad that the baby was a girl. To make matters worse, the guilt of being Percy's mistress was starting to get to her. After all, while she was pregnant, Percy's actual wife was also pregnant. As Mary worked through her grief and guilt, she continued writing Frankenstein. And during this process, Mary's half-sister Fanny committed suicide, and only a couple months afterwards, Percy's wife Harriet also committed suicide. Horrifically, Mary and Percy got married almost immediately after this happened. Within half a year, Frankenstein's first edition was complete. Mary's grief at losing her child and the horror and guilt-ridden disgust at what her body had created is a key feature of Frankenstein, the book she wrote while working through her bereavement alone. Then later, when she gave birth to another daughter, Clara Everina, Percy neglected the sick baby to go hang out with Lord Byron, and the baby passed away. Percy, like Victor Frankenstein, craves creating and coveting beautiful things, but can't handle the responsibility and grotesqueness of parenthood. On the flip side, Mary herself experienced the horror of giving birth to an underdeveloped, short-lived infant. Her grief and fear surrounding her experience being a mother, as well as knowing her own birth was the cause of her own mother's death, is clearly imbued in the characterizations of both Victor and the creature. Victor is horrified by motherhood, and the creature is horrified by having been created.
I think also definitely a significant point to be made here is the fact that in the original
edition of Frankenstein, Victor is way less sympathetic than the edited version of him in the 1830s edition after she revised it. Perhaps may have been influenced by some of her conflicting feelings surrounding Percy after his very tragic death, drowning at quite a young age. So in the interpretation in which Mary is the creature and Percy is Victor Frankenstein, one of many interpretations, it makes sense that she would want to make Victor more sympathetic and have the creature have conflicting feelings of Victor's death after Percy died. These characters, which exist in each other's image, are equally Mary and Percy Shelley. Mary also envisioning herself as the creature, and Percy as Victor is a relevant reading too in regards to the semi-incestuous relationships at play in their social circle. Percy was attracted to his friend Thomas Hogg, who was attracted to Percy's then wife Harriet, and then Hogg was attracted to Mary, and Percy tried to convince Mary to have sex with Hogg. Meanwhile, Percy was possibly pursuing Claire Claremont, who was attracted to Lord Byron, who was attracted mutually to Percy. It's such a mess. Mary envisioned herself as partially a creature of Percy's creation, in that he had encouraged and nurtured her writing only to be abandoned by him whenever she needed him the most. And yet, like the creature to Victor, Mary still loved and craved his company. In the end of the book, the creature and Victor are locked in a chase to the ends of the earth, and when Victor dies, the creature wails over his body in mourning. Her interpersonal strife aside, we definitely should revisit those conversations that Percy and Byron were having that influenced Mary's plotting. The century preceding the birth of all three people in this equation was 100 years of political turmoil, as well as the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, which would shock the developed world into a frightening new era of science, machinery, and technology. Suddenly, science and technological innovation was viewed not just as the secretive study of the rich, but a curious interest that was fascinating people from all walks of life. Consequently, huge strides were being made in all scientific spheres, but in particular in the medical sphere, where doctors were increasingly making new discoveries about the human body and how life is created. But there was fear and horror in the world too. Scientific progress, especially medical, is often built on gore, exploitation, and death. In Mary Shelley's lifetime, the scourge of resurrection men, or guys who dug up and sold corpses to be dissected by surgeons at medical universities, was a huge and controversial issue, especially in the UK. Check out my video on the subject to learn more about that. But the biggest scandal of the era was in Edinburgh, as it was revealed that two men, Burke and Hare, were actually murdering people to provide bodies to make money. The horror and controversy of this scandal certainly weighed on Mary Shelley's mind as she wrote of Victor Frankenstein piecing corpses together to create a new man in the name of scientific progress. But Victor's specific mission is also at odds with modern science and innovation. He dabbles more in the historical, alchemical chemistry that was being ridiculed by scholars of his day, naturally creating an occult being that has no place in modern society. Catherine Harkup writes in Making the Monster, there had been a significant shift in attitude towards alchemy and alchemists in the 18th century. The scientific advancements of the Enlightenment era had revealed a rational universe underpinned by comprehensible, definable, and quantifiable phenomena. Rather than a place of mysteries and the whim of gods, the universe was seen increasingly in mechanistic terms. Those who summoned demons to reveal truths, or tried to transmute metals into gold, were ridiculed and considered by Enlightenment philosophers as misguided at best. At worst, their behavior was thought of as criminal or against God. Never mind the misunderstood nature of alchemy, which I've covered in another video, but the unnaturalness of alchemy, and therefore playing God as it was seen in the 18th century, is a key factor in Victor's hubris. He deigns to create life unnaturally with ancient and spooky methods, overcome by the excitement of scientific discovery, only to be confronted with the disturbing and obscene result of his endeavors. Regardless of if the creature is evil or not, and he isn't at first, but is rather made evil through his suffering, Victor's societal prejudices were always going to prevent him from doing justice by his own creation, because he's not God. He's a human, and he is not equipped to handle the sublimity of creation. These social prejudices that drive Victor into terror and panic are certainly rooted in these themes of a frightening modernity at odds with the mystical past, but the other social prejudices flowing through these characters comes from the anxiety of masculinity and queerness. I want to give credit where credit is due right off the bat here. So much of the best scholarship surrounding Frankenstein and queerness comes from Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick and Mair Rigby. I want to apologize for mispronouncing Mair Rigby's name in this entire video. That's really on me. I used to know someone who had the same spelling of the name and it was pronounced Mair. So I incorrectly assumed that it was pronounced the same way. It's actually pronounced Mair. So Mair Rigby, I am very sorry. Sedgwick, rest in peace, was the author of some of my favorite queer studies books, in particular Between Men, English Literature and Male Homosocial Desire, which covers Frankenstein in great detail, and Epistemology of the Closet. Both are such good books, highly recommend. Mair Rigby cites Sedgwick's work a lot and has also written extensively specifically on Frankenstein and queer Gothic literature. Her papers are so good, she's written a bazillion of them, although almost impossible to read without institutional access, the bane of my existence. Shout out to my friends Ned and Paige for getting me these papers for me in this video. Anyways, yes, if this topic makes you want to read more, go check them out, as well as all of the other great authors in my sources section. The era in which Frankenstein was conceived was the height of the Romantic era, in which ideals of heroism, beauty, and homosocial bonds were the poetic goal. Romantic friendships were the socially accepted way that two men or two women could live lives together, mimicking a regular relationship, but in its own way. People of the same gender were allowed to express deep and intimate love for each other, and have a great deal of physical intimacy, sometimes even on a sexual level. Lots of nuance here, but generally a lot of the relationships between people back then, which were indeed very public, would look extremely recognizable to us as queer relationships today. Part of this was because of the extreme separations of the male and female spheres. It was considered improper for there to be too much overlap between the two, so naturally people were socializing more homosocially and were raised to not really view men and women on equal terms. As a result, the most intense bonds between people end up being homosocial too. You can see this in Frankenstein between, firstly, Robert Walton, who in his letters to Margaret yearns for, quote, the company of a man who could sympathize with me, whose eyes would reply to mine. Literally, he goes on and on about how badly he yearns for a male romantic companion. Then, when Victor is taken onto the ship, he goes on and on about how cool and sexy he is. He must have been a noble creature in his better days, being even now in wreck too attractive and amiable. I said in one of my letters, my dear Margaret, that I should find no friend in the wild ocean. Yet I have found a man who, before his spirit had been broken by misery, I should have been happy to have possessed as the brother of my heart. Then in the next letter, he keeps yapping about his crush on Victor. My affection for my guest increases every day. He excites at once my admiration and my pity to an astonishing degree. How can I see so noble a creature destroyed by misery without feeling the most poignant grief? He is so gentle, yet so wise. His mind is so cultivated, and when he speaks, although his words are culled with the choicest art, yet they flow with rapidity and unparalleled eloquence. It's just a little funny to me that Mary Shelley gives even the bond between Walton and Victor more page time than the bond between Victor and Elizabeth. Although at the end of the book, Victor declares how Walton could never be to him what Elizabeth and Henry more poignantly were, but I suppose it makes sense when you think of her own life when she was writing the dang book. In the 1831 intro, she even says, "Many and long were the conversations between Lord Byron and Percy Shelley, to which I was a devout and nearly silent listener." In the face of the homosocial bond between that nefarious slut Lord Byron, whom I have already made a video on, go watch it, and her own husband, Mary Shelley found herself resigned as a third wheel. Although historically, it's hard to say fully what the exact nature of Shelley and Byron's relationship actually was, the intimacy of it was undoubtable. Mary Shelley herself had little issue with this, as it was heavily understood how homosocial relationships can take precedence over even a marriage. And besides, marriage wasn't exactly sacred to Percy Shelley in the first place, and Mary knew it. She had started out turbulently as his mistress during his previous marriage, which ended with his ex-wife's suicide. The idea of the great man with enormous talents, whose first love is his art, allowing him to neglect his personal duties and relationships, is a very, very persistent one. The relationship between Victor and Henry obviously mimics many of the masculine romantic friendships that Mary Shelley was privy to, but his creature also represents the anxiety surrounding queerness even in a romantic era context. It wasn't always a safe space. In fact, it could be very hostile. Victor succeeds in creating life without the body of a woman involved, and as soon as the creature wakes up, he is horrified and disgusted, despite the fact that he had created his creature with features specifically chosen to be sublimely beautiful. Worth noting is the already established homoerotic tension of the male gaze, as Walton writes of his, quote, desire of the company of a man, whose eyes would reply to mine. When Victor is about to regale his tale of woe, Walton exclaims in his letter, even now as I commence my task, his full-toned voice swells in my ears, his lustrous eyes dwell upon me with their melancholy sweetness. Contrary to this sweet, lustrous gaze, it's the creature's gaze, which sends Victor into a panic, rendering him literally infirmed and suffering a nervous breakdown for weeks, which Henry has to nurse him back from. You could potentially read the creature in this way as a representation of Victor's unnamed abnormal sexual feelings, in that his love for Henry is socially acceptable, but anything deeper than that is abhorrent and deprives him of both his love, Henry, and his social tether, Elizabeth, notably on their wedding night. If we take a step back, we can recognize Frankenstein, even in its historical context, as a story that, like all Gothic literature, is made to give the reader a chance to, perhaps perversely, experience abnormal desire. As Mary Shelley grew up, Gothic fiction was viewed as extremely controversial in that it seemingly subverted normative behavior and promoted vice and queer eroticisms. She was obviously aware of this. Gothic literature, and especially Gothic horror of the Romantic era, aka Gothic romance, often dealt with deviant sexuality and desire. It's inherently open to a queer reading, even just by merit of being a product of the Romantic era or the eras sandwiching it. I think a lot of people today get confused and think that Gothic romance really just means a kind of spooky love story, when it really has more to do with capital R romanticism, the 19th century movement. So as a result, you get a lot of online discourse ranting about if XYZ Gothic romance is abusive or not, and it's that's not the point. Anyway, I digress. Mair Rigby writes in Do You Share My Madness? Frankenstein's Queer Gothic, the sexually tense knowledge-power relationships between characters in Frankenstein encourage a simultaneous sexually tense knowledge-power relationship between the reader and the text. Much of the queer Gothic reading pleasure lies in experiencing the play of recognition, knowledge and ignorance in these narratives, and in being put in the alarming but also thrilling position of the other one in the text who might recognize the meaning and who might, therefore, be reading in dangerous proximity to the sexual code. Victor Frankenstein's question addressed to Walton, "Do you share my madness?" also appeals to the reader, who has been allowed to come dangerously close to recognizing her or his own desire for the abnormal. But, of course, the reader does not have to admit to knowing or recognizing anything, because the dispersal of queer meaning into coded language and connotation always allows her or him to remain officially and safely ignorant. The creature himself is in some ways the blueprint for the everlasting connection between the queer and the monstrous. In the context of the deeply homophobic environment of early 19th century Europe, even though romantic friendships were allowed, the grotesqueness of the creature is a fairly blatant metaphor for sexuality gone too far. The belief that homosexual acts were the cause of or result of madness is reflected in Victor's nervous breakdown as the creature looms over the narrative, like a specter, inciting paranoia and terror in the previously level-headed and normal Victor. He says, "How they would, each and all, abhor me, and hunt me from the world, Did they know my unhallowed acts? In his previously sacred sphere of masculinity, Victor has created the uncanny, the perverse, and sinful, a creature that literally confronts him in his bedchamber, pulling aside the drapes of his bed, grinning, and instilling in Victor a soul-shaking panic over the grotesque and sexually threatening thing he has done. The only thing that returns him to his senses, and therefore restores the safety of the masculine sphere, is the arrival of his romantic friend Henry, and the departure of the creature, and a letter from his bride-to-be, Elizabeth. Elizabeth specifically represents normalcy for Victor, just as the presence of a doting and beautiful wife would establish safety around the romantic and homoerotic friendships of any 19th century man. You can be as safely gay as you want, with the shield of a wife in front of you. Mary Shelley was extremely familiar with this. How women were viewed in this era becomes rapidly clear from the get-go in Victor's tale. He describes how his parents met, that his father, Alphonse Frankenstein, met his mother, Caroline Beaufort, as she wept over her father's coffin, and he took her in, quote, like a protecting spirit to the girl, who committed herself to his care, essentially becoming her father figure as well as her husband. Side note, I don't really know why Guillermo del Toro changed Caroline's name to Claire, except maybe as a reference to Mary Shelley's half-sister Claire Claremont. Beats me. Anyway, Elizabeth too is immediately portrayed as a sort of possession. When she comes to live with the Frankensteins as their ward, she is said to be a pretty present for Victor, enabling him to view her immediately as the property that women were often seen as. He says, "I looked upon Elizabeth as mine, a possession of my own." In truth, Elizabeth is a largely underdeveloped character, and the most agency she shows is later in the book when she tells Victor that maybe they shouldn't get married if his heart's not really in it. I can see why Guillermo definitely wanted to develop her character more. The symbolism with the insects and the beautiful bugs trapped in cages is a really good reflection of her essential role in the original story. I liked that part. A huge facet of the book, though, is the incompatibility of the male and female spheres, the domestic and the public. The women in Frankenstein are not permitted access to the public sphere. Caroline requests that her husband leave his public life in order to be a good father, Justine is functionally a maid, and Elizabeth lives at home waiting for Victor to complete his masculine endeavors so they can get married, with Elizabeth and Justine together acting as William's surrogate mothers after Caroline's death. Caroline dies after nursing the ailing Elizabeth with scarlet fever, Justine dies after being framed for a murder by the creature, and Elizabeth is murdered directly by the creature. Caroline's is a little less on the nose, but Justine and Elizabeth's deaths are caused by Victor's masculine hubris and his inability to enact the feminine domestic responsibilities of a parent in his creation. This social view of women as caring possessions leads the creature to deliberately ask Victor to make him a bride, a woman just like himself who he can essentially possess. And this is the moment when the greatest tensions in the entire book come into play. The creature himself never asked to be born and has only suffered for it, and now he's asking Victor to commit this painful act of creation yet again to create an inherently doomed woman who both has not asked to be created this way, but also has not asked to be given as a pretty present to the creature as Elizabeth was to Victor. This dilemma haunts Victor as he works on her. What if the bride refuses to stay with the creature, thus restarting the cycle of violence? What if, in being created as a supposedly monstrous woman, she fails to uphold her domestic companion duties and becomes more violent than the creature? When Victor destroys his work and invokes the creature's rage once more, rather than lashing out directly at Victor, he seeks to destroy the pillars of Victor's masculinity by destroying his domestic tethers, Henry, and then Elizabeth. In asking for the bride, the creature has also asked Victor for his own tether to domesticity, a last-ditch effort to achieve promised social happiness. The creature recognizes himself as queer, especially in relation to being created in Victor's own image, saying, "Cursed my creator, why did you form a monster so hideous that even you turned from me in disgust? God in pity made man beautiful and alluring after his own image, but my form is a filthy type of yours. more horrid from its very resemblance. As much as Victor and the creature hate and are disgusted by each other, they can't help being mirror images of each other in the end. James Holt McGavran writes, British patriarchy requires and even revels in male homosocial desire, the bonds of attraction and competition that drive boys and men's careers in school, sports, military service, business, and the professions. In other words, men are encouraged to do everything together except have sexual intercourse, which is absolutely forbidden and reviled. Because of this panic, close friendship and/or professional association can in an instant change into distrust and outright hate. Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick comments acutely, "For a man to be a man's man is separated by only an invisible, carefully blurred, always already crossed line from being interested in men." This line is illustrated more plainly than ever in Frankenstein. Victor's relationships with Walton and Clerval are safe, encouraged, and healthy, nurturing. They literally, both of them, act as Victor's nurses, his confidants, his tethers to life. The creature, meanwhile, represents a grotesque union, a madness-inciting, perverse curse that locks Victor in essentially a suicide pact that ends with the death of both him and the creature. While her intentions in writing Frankenstein were almost certainly not to make a direct commentary about, queerness and being gay, Mary Shelley's adult life was constantly colored by the issue, and it absolutely impacted her. Percy Shelley was a complicated person who grappled with uncomfortable feelings between the greater British disgust towards homosexuality and his own homoerotic feelings, in particular towards his school friend T.J. Hogg. Shelley even, apparently, was interested in Hogg being the third in his relationship with Mary. And then came his dalliances with the nefarious slut Lord Byron, who Mary was also interested in to an extent. Her own conflicted feelings about sexuality at large, as well as being attracted to queer men in the deeply hostile and homophobic environment she lived in, naturally made her produce a story that holds so much paranoia and fear surrounding male sexuality. The fun thing about Frankenstein is that it's so complex and multifaceted that you can do 100 readings on it and it usually makes sense. I think that's part of the discourse, honestly. Everyone has their favorite or preferred Frankenstein metaphor, and a lot of people get upset by differing interpretations. But the fact is that Mary Shelley wrote this book over the course of years with an enormous number of influences. We literally don't even have time to address the colonialism thing today. And it's a book that naturally asks you to contemplate a number of existential issues, any one of them being intentional or not. As Carmilla M. Morell writes in Built Bodies, Representations of Monstrous Transsexuality in the Frankenstein film 1945 to 1975, to wit, it seems as if Frankenstein itself, both the original novel and the larger myth that includes its cinematic legacy, contains unlimited meanings and metaphors. Paul O'Flynn argues that there is no such thing as Frankenstein, there are only Frankensteins, as the text is ceaselessly rewritten, reproduced, refilmed, and redesigned. And that while the text meant certain things in 1818, it meant and could be made to mean different things in 1931 and 1957, and so on, irrespective of authorial intention. This sentiment has been repeated ceaselessly. Lester Friedman and Alison Cavey wrote that every academic gets the Frankenstein they want to see, and Robert Horton said, more broadly, that each historical moment gets the Frankenstein it needs. I mean, you could really say that of any classic and popular text. Frankenstein, because its core themes of humanity, otherness, ambition, and loss, is a fertile ground for people to get out of it what they need from it. Hence why Guillermo del Toro, despite being a Frankenstein superfan, has created a Frankenstein film massively divorced from the text he loves so much, making it essentially, as he called it, a Mexican telenovela about toxic fatherhood and sympathetic monstrousness. It's Frankenstein as Beauty and the Beast. Hollywood knows, subjectively, that most viewers don't really like stories without a very clear-cut hero and villain. And so the original Victor, a young man described by Walton as perhaps wild and mad due to his trauma, but also a beam of benevolence and sweetness that I never saw equaled, becomes a middle-aged narcissist who truly loves no one and whose only motivation is ambition, lust, rage, and jealousy.
You are the monster.
And the creature, who self-describes himself in the book as a miserable wretch driven to evil and hatred willingly and even proudly, murdering the innocent and children in order to torment Victor, is made into a singularly innocent, sweet, childlike victim who literally feeds a deer berries out of his hand. I get it. It's easier to sympathize with him this way. It doesn't make you uncomfortable. But more graciously to Guillermo, I think it's simply the story he wanted to tell. So I already know by the time I started even the first section of this video, a bunch of people probably already went down to the comments to yell at me, Frankenstein isn't gay, you freaks make everything about being gay. Because everyone says that on every video I make about queer stuff. And to that I say, you're right. Frankenstein is about being bisexual. Jokes aside, though, that's my point. I'm disappointed in the film in that it had so much poignant nuance and complexity taken away from the story. Henry isn't there, Justine isn't there, and everyone has sort of been whittled down to like a comical singular facet of their personality. I don't know that doing that to a story that begs you to consider the existential implications of treating an innocent person like a monster is doing us any favors. But that's just my opinion, and you're allowed to disagree with me. I may be disappointed in this film, but the thing is, Guillermo del Toro's love for this story is still very palpable, and the artistry here is undeniable, except for my qualms with the cinematography and digital camera work. God, I wish this was shot on film. But that's beside the point. The point is, it seems like this is our modern Frankenstein, until we get a new one, and the discourse will start all over again. How fun's that gonna be? Will we ever get an adaptation that actually follows the book, even mostly? Who's to say? But maybe we won't, because Frankenstein seems to beckon us to confront monstrousness within ourselves, whatever that form takes. Thank you for learning with me about the fears behind Frankenstein. If you've seen the new movie, what did you think about it? I'd love to hear your opinions in the comments below. Don't forget to check out my channel on Nebula, as well as a ton of other amazing creators through my link in the description below. Check it out. You can also head down there to grab a copy of my graphic novel, Liberated: The Radical Art and Life of Claude Cahun. And until next time, wash thy hands, wear thy mask, and take responsibility for what you create.
You are the monster.